Good afternoon. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Frank, for taking the time today and doing this webinar with us. This webinar is done jointly by QED and Remo One, and we are really happy to have Frank as our first speaker today. So just briefly to explain you the way we are going to do this webinar today. Joanne, who is which is a representative of QED here, she will be our expert. So she will speak about the standards, give her vision of the standards, and then Frank will give us a little introduction, and then we will do Q&A. Frank Bostyn is the Dean of UAE Business School, was a former elected member of the AACSB Director Board. So thank you, Frank, for being with us today. If you want to say a few words about yourself, I will let you speak about yourself. But I think also what would be really interesting for everybody today is, since you were behind the scene, because you were in the board of AACSB when this decision of changing standards was taken, would you be maybe able to introduce and explain us the reason behind the scene for this evolution toward the new standards?
Okay, thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. I want to repeat, you already said it, Ben, and stress it. I'm no longer a member of the board of AACSB, and I'm not speaking on behalf of AACSB. Let's be clear. But I was indeed a participant in the whole process. I just can remind you that before the standards for business accreditation were changed, there was also already a change in the standards for accounting. This is not irrelevant because certain elements of the evolution were then taken over also during the discussion business standards. So basically, if I look back, there are many reasons why an organization is certainly trying to change certain elements. But if you look at the discussions we had, and broader than in the board, also in committees and so on, there is a recognition since quite a while that the environment of the business schools is changing very rapidly, a lot of changes, and that changes keep on coming because the environment, the economy is changing, and so on. If you look at that, you immediately think that if you want to accommodate change and adaptation, schools adapting to the new environment, you have to avoid that your standards are too prescriptive. So that's an important driver. So we already have seen that AACSB is stressing innovation, relevance, impact. And if you want that in a continuous base, in fact, you should not have too strict prescriptive standards. And that is in fact what triggered the idea. Should we not change them, and should we not change the approach and have a more principle-based, open-based approach for the standards? Now, with that, then you are looking, as AACSB has always promoted mission-driven accreditation, how do you link that kind of necessary flexibility, agility with this mission-driven approach? And you immediately come to the aspect of consistency. How consistent is in school in what the school is doing in terms of positioning? So the translated in terms of thinking about the standard means that the idea of strategy and strategy alignment is reinforced. We already had it in the old standards, but if you look in the new standard, it's much more promoted. It's much more pronounced, sorry. So a commitment to strategic management becomes very important. A commitment to quality, of course, is very important, which is, let's say, the learner success in the terminology of the standards. And this drive for keeping relevant is expressed in the third cluster of standards, the impact of thought leadership. So the clusters, in the three clusters of the standards come quite logically if you reflect it from this perspective. Now, when you are saying that you have to move away from too prescriptive standards to more, let's say, this strategic oriented kind of approach, well, the next consequence is that you need to base it on professional judgment. The aspect of judgment is much more part of the strategy. So, strategy center, do you have a strategy? What it means? Are you, as a school, well considering what your strategy is? Do you have the necessary resources to implement this strategy? Is this all aligned with your strategy? This is in fact the first elements of the whole assessment through the standard. The second is then about, do you deliver accordingly? And that's the learner success and the quality and are you monitoring that? And the third is the impact, as already said. So it is quite coherent, in my opinion, what has been done. But essential is that it is much more, a less prescriptive, but essential, much more a strategy-driven kind of approach. You have to choose what your positioning is. There are different missions possible, but do you live up to that? Do you have a clear strategy that you are trying to implement? Are your processes, are your resources aligned with that? And that brings me to where you also see some hesitation in the new standards. If you look, for instance, at alignment of your resources, the essential resources of assets of a business school is, of course, the faculty. And if you look at that and you see how they deal in the new standards with that, you still feel that there is a kind of hesitation to move a bit further. What kind of faculty do you need? You still see some prescriptive elements, and you can see it, in fact, normally where you would say, okay, I'm this type of school, hence I need that kind of expertise, that kind of faculty, that's the right qualification, that's the right mix. But you see that in the standards, there is still the reference to traditional disciplines in one or another way. And there is still the ratios there in a maybe softer, but still prescriptive matter. Well, okay, it's a transition, because at the same time, if you purely leave it to a judgment process from your peers, there are risks involved also in terms of consistency from AACSB. I think they understood that very well. That's also why they are investing a lot in training, coaching the peers who will be doing the review process, because it's quite new. And we have also seen with the 2013 standards that there is always an inclination to look for prescriptive measures, because it's much easier. You see it from the side from the school, you see it often from the side from the peer reviewers. It's easier to have something where you just can check the boxes, but that's not what the standards want. In that sense, it's also a cultural change, and AACSB, I think, is doing the right thing in terms of making sure that the colleagues who will go out to peer review the schools are sufficiently trained or aligned with all that. I will keep it here, Benjamin, and of course.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. So now we are going to hear from Joanne of how you passed from 15 standard to 9 standard, and a quick overview of everything. One thing I forgot to mention is we want it to be as lively as possible. So I am monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. So if you have questions at any moment of something that Joanne or Frank are speaking about, please feel free to shoot your questions and I'll pass them on to them. And once Joanne has finished the presentation, we will have a live Q&A. So please, again, really engage with us and we will be really keen on that.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks, Frank, for that overview and introduction. So just to give you an idea, what I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes or so is to take an overview of the 2020 standards, from my perspective and from what I see that I think will challenge schools. And I'm going to look on, first of all, the things that remain the same. So what are the key principles that are unchanged? The changes that are there. So a headline view of the changes to watch out for. And then we'll take a little look at the transition period. And just to say up front that remember that we have another webinar next Thursday and one the Thursday after, where we're going to go a little more deeply into the area around faculty qualifications and sufficiency and the area around assurance of learning. So I'll touch on those today, but we will come back to those next week. So the reason I wanted to start with, what remains the same is I think that anytime we're presented with a new set of standards or new material, the temptation is really to focus solely on the changes. And, it's really important to understand the changes and the differences, but it's also really important to recognize the principles that remain similar. At a QED, we've often referred to our core QED accreditation principles, and these provide a useful framework to explore the similarities between the 2020 and the 2013 standards. So, for example, our first accreditation principle ties closely to the fundamental purpose of AACSB. So AACSB says that it's about encouraging business schools to hold themselves accountable for improving business practice through a commitment to strategic management, learner success, and impactful thought leadership. And that's on page 9 in the new standards. The key phrase for me is really around holding accountable for improving business practice. I mean, the bottom line is that whether you talk about AACSB, EFMD, AMBA, that all of these are systems of continuous improvement. And in any of these, the context remains important. Every school is on its own journey, and it doesn't matter whether you're coming into your first accreditation or whether you're going for your umpteenth re-accreditation. Part of holding ourselves accountable recognizes on knowing where the school is coming from, where it's sitting now, and where it's going into the future, and that journey and that trajectory really matters. The next thing that I'd like to refer to is that AACSB continues to talk about the intersection of academic and professional engagement in the context of mission. And this closely links back to the second accreditation principle, our triangle of excellence. So within the triangle of excellence, you've got 3 points, as you'd expect, on a triangle. So quality degree programs. These are programs that are informed by academic rigor. And this academic rigor is developed through research and intellectual contributions. And it has a real world application and skills, which is informed by engagement of practice, whether it's executive education, whether it's consulting, research projects that are dealing with industry, etc. Second point of the triangle is around research and intellectual contributions. So really what we're looking at here is a record of scholarship that's developed through faculty engagement in research, in intellectual contributions, and it's informed and informs degree programs and inputs from the real world through executive education and supporting practices. And then the final point is that strong application to practice. So this application to practice acts as an outcome for education and research, but also acts as an input into scholarly activity and into our degree programs. For me, the big learning and the continued learning is that there has to be a strong and sustained interconnection between all 3 points of the triangle. And this provides a really firm foundation in AACSB terminology for this intersection between academic and professional engagement. And then Frank referred to this. He mentioned the focus on strategic management, the focus on mission. And our third principle is that everything connects. So AACSB accreditation continues to take place in this context of each institution's specific mission. And always remember, of course, when we're talking about AACSB and we mention mission, we're talking about the mission statement, the vision statement, the values, and the key strategic objectives. And as Frank said, these have to be consistent. There needs to be an alignment. Everything connects and ties back to this clear, distinctive mission at the center of a principle of AACSB. And it was a central principle within the 2013 standards. And if anything, it's even been further reinforced within the 2020 standards. Other areas that are broadly similar, AACSB is still maintaining its 3 pillars of engagement, innovation, and impact. Many of the requirements throughout the standards are broadly similar, but, and I will come to this again in the differences, and as Frank alluded to, there's much more focus on principles, so on the spirit and the intent of the standards. The other thing I'd say is that data requirements are broadly similar, but they're not the same. So there's probably the same level of data requirement, but there are some subtle changes which come through in some of the changes within the standards. So having looked at that, let's look at the changes. As Frank alluded to, I mean, most of us are aware that the 2013 standards were grouped as 15 standards across 4 categories. And one of the very early stated objectives for the Business Accreditation Task Force within AACSB, and kudos to them for this, was to simplify the structure and reduce duplication. So one of the frustrations we often heard from schools was like, where do we put this information? It seems to be duplicated across a lot of the standards. So the new standards are in 3 clusters or 3 groups: strategic management and innovation, learner success, and thought leadership, engagement, and societal impact. So it's a better grouping of accreditation themes. And within that first one, as Frank suggested, you've got strategic planning initially, and then standards 2 and 3 in the same cluster to really focus on the resources that are available to the school to drive those standards. Just for convenience, we've added in roughly where the old, or the 2013 standards, I shouldn't say old because it's all a continuum, but where the 2013 standards map to the 2020 standards, broadly speaking. And this has really responded to this need to simplify and reduce duplication. So what you see here, for example, in standard 3, they've taken what was in the 2013 standard 5 around faculty sufficiency, standard 6 around faculty development, standard 7 around professional staff resourcing and development, and standard 15 around faculty qualifications. And they've brought all these together in one standard around faculty and professional staff resources. So inherently, it sits together much more tightly. Another one that might be worth looking at is within standard 5, which is assurance of learning. The standard on executive education is no longer a standalone standard. It is actually embedded into other areas. And one of the key areas where it's embedded is within standard 5, assurance of learning. And I hasten to add, and it'll become clear when we do our 3rd webinar, but that's not to say that you're being required to do an AOL process, particularly for executive education. It's nothing like that. But assurance of learning is a really good, appropriate place to put some of the material around executive education and the quality assurance that exists there. The final thing to mention is that there's one new standard. So I would say that the 2020 standards have really focused even more on this idea of societal impact, societal engagement, and making a positive impact. It was there in the 2013 standards, but it's really been focused more. And we have our one new standard is around this. And really this underlines an imperative for business schools to demonstrate a positive impact on society. And that both supports AACSB's vision within its own collective vision, and also should support the vision and mission within schools themselves. That business schools exist, fundamentally one of their objectives is to better society in some way, to have a positive impact. The one thing I'd say about standard 9 is that it's important to be aware that this doesn't refer to what I've seen in many schools as kind of ad hoc contributions to society, where there's different key initiatives that happen, but they're not really tied together. In standard 9, the focus is really on how the school is supporting engagement in societal impact and how it ties in strategically to what the school does and is resourced appropriately and how the impact is measured. So it needs to be really looked at from an overall school perspective. One of the big changes in the 2020 standards is this idea that it's a principles-based framework. Now, the 2013 standards did have principles built into the standards, but many consider them to be more compliance focused, as Frank said, more prescriptive. And there really is a need as business schools change and adapt, and that change is expected to continue, to have a more principles-based framework. And I guess the new standards really take a strong stand in this, and the focus is very explicitly on the spirit and the intent. Now, one of the chatter, for want of a better phrase, that I've heard is that in this some way makes the standards less rigorous or easier. And I think that's a really dangerous road to go down. In my view, principles-based means that schools do have more flexibility. But more flexibility also means more grey areas and more subjectivity. So this has a double impact. On one side, you've got the challenge for reviewers. And AACSB has been very careful, and anybody who's attended any of the recent seminars or conferences will have heard AACSB talk very clearly and very openly about a professional judgment framework. And within this professional judgment framework, reviewers are being asked to go through a 4-step process, which is evaluate, ask, confer, and make. Under evaluate, reviewers are being asked to evaluate the evidence that's presented and the documentation that's presented. If you are uncertain about whether schools have met the spirit and the intent of the standard, then you need to ask questions. So reviewers are being encouraged to really dive in and ask questions where they may have concerns around the alignment and the spirit and the intent of the standards. Once they've asked questions, the peer reviewers are then asked to confer. So to confer with each other, to discuss the ins and outs and stand back and really look at whether the spirit and the intent of the standards has been met, and to reach a consensus decision on that. And only at that point are they being asked to make a judgment. So it's a really clear, addition to the toolkit where they're being asked to use this framework. But I think importantly, what this does is it brings a responsibility to institutions, even more than the 2013 standards, to be really transparent, to be really strategically driven, and to be ready to clearly explain and evidence any areas where you're not aligning directly with the standards, that you can demonstrate and document evidence of quality outcomes and clearly articulate the school strategy and the reasons for this. And as Frank said, it's all about being consistent with your strategy and producing high quality outcomes. Now, it's important to say that there is documentation and support available for this directly from AACSB. So they've got webinars coming up in November, which I would encourage everybody to attend. They're free webinar series that they're offering. But they've got lots of documentation on the website. But one of the things I want to draw your particular attention to is that in addition to the actual document for the guiding principles and standards, which in effect is the standards themselves, there's also a second document with a green cover called the 2020 Interpretive Guidance. And this acts, I guess I've heard AACSB describe it as a master white paper. And it really gives additional explanation and examples of the guidance in action. And I think it's going to be a really, really valuable document for any school that's looking to transition and use the new standards. So one I would definitely suggest you go to. You should find it easily on the AACSB website, but if there's any problems, if you drop me an email afterwards, I'll point you in the right direction or send you a copy of it. The next area I want to talk about very briefly are changes in terminology. So terminology is updated and internationalized more. So some of the examples we would see would be things like, instead of students, we're talking about learners. Students study, learners learn. And this ties into this idea of a lifelong learning mindset. Another one that I would refer to is they're using the word competency versus learning objectives. But it's really important, and I'm going to come back to this point again and again, to read the definitions, because competency in AACSB terminology is a very broad-based definition talking about knowledge, skills, and attributes, rather than some of the more defined definitions of competency that we see, particularly, I think, across Western Europe, where competency is seen more as a context sensitive, skills-based, work-based evidence of learning. So AACSB is taking a wider definition, knowledge, skills, and attributes. And this brings me to a really important point, that anytime you come across definitions, it's really important to read the definitions within the standards. We all know from our work internationally that what something means in one jurisdiction or even in one school can be subtly different in important ways to how it's meant in another school. So when you're using the terminology in relation to the standards, it's really important to look at what AACSB has defined and what is given you as a definition for that terminology. And I'm going to talk about collaborative provisions or collaborative partnerships in a moment, and that's going to be really important there. The other ones, just to be conscious of around terminology, sometimes the terminology is about clarification. So for example, when we talk about something like faculty qualification, we would typically have been told to look for somebody who's doctorally qualified for an SA and PA, and that would typically be considered somebody who's got a PhD. Now, AACSB has long accepted other forms of terminal degrees, such as DBAs, LLMs, so long as it's appropriate for the context of that particular faculty member. But the 2020 standards clarify that by changing the terminology to terminal degree. And the other one, of course, that I think many of us are aware of is that what was previously referred to as other faculty has now become additional faculty. But the nature of that faculty hasn't changed. It's purely a change in terminology. I said I wanted to talk briefly about collaborative partnerships. And I do know I'm throwing a lot of information out here, but this is a broad overview. So when we talk about scope in AACSB, scope comes at 3 levels. So the first scope is at the accredited entity. So when you go for accreditation, the default accreditation entity is generally the institution. But as many of you are aware, schools can also go choose or apply to be accredited as a single business unit, which is often just the business school in itself. Under the 2013 standards, there was multiple criteria that you had to satisfy to satisfy the eligibility criteria to be an SBU or a single business unit. It was around things like branding, external market perception, there was autonomy, there was financing, there was, I think there was 5 or 6 different criteria. Under the 2020 standards, this has really been refined back, and the key focus is on branding and external market perception. Now, the one thing I would just add here, and this hasn't changed, is that it's really only in very particular situations that it's advantageous for a school to go for accreditation as a single business unit rather than the default institutional accreditation. So if you're new to this area, don't assume that's something you should jump down to simplify. It's an area that needs to be looked at very carefully, and it's very useful to talk to AACSB in advance about making any decision like that. When it comes to program scope, the second level of scoping, generally for programs, this hasn't changed from the 2013 standards. So I'm just going to leave that here. But I am going to refer to collaborative partnerships. Under the 2013 standards, one of the areas that often caused confusion, debate, sometimes even shockwaves during peer review visits, was scoping around collaborative partnerships and whether particular collaborative partnerships should fall in scope or out of scope of accreditation. AACSB has gone to huge lengths to add clarification to this area. And one of the things I would draw your particular attention to is that they've drawn up a collaborative partnerships set of definitions on page 14 of the standards. And this table lists the typical collaborative partnerships, very much in line with the equal definition, if those of you are familiar with the equal paper, defines what it means by each of those collaborative partnerships, and then specifies whether those partnerships are in scope or out of scope. Now, if a partnership is out of scope, it still comes into your documents, but the focus is more on kind of overall strategic alignment, general quality processes and assurance, and kind of general areas like that. If a school is in scope, it means that in addition to looking at overall strategic alignment and general quality assurance, that AAC expects that any faculty associated with programs in that partnership must be included on your faculty tables, and that any programs that are formed as part of that partnership come under your AOL processes. So there's a really big difference. And that's an area that I would recommend every school takes a look at that table, takes a look at your own partnership and map where your partnerships fall in terms of the definitions. And again, read the definitions. I cannot say that enough, because what you might mean by a dual degree or a double degree or a validation might actually be subtly different to the way it's defined. So it must be by the AACSB definitions. And once you've done that mapping, then follow through on where the scoping lands. The next area is the unit of faculty reporting. And I'm only going to refer to this in broad terms because we are going to look at this more deeply in our webinar next Tuesday. So under the 2013 standards, when you were reporting on faculty or on research, the unit of reporting was at the choice of the school. And most schools did this reporting by department or by an administrative structure that made sense for the school. AACSB has looked at this and they've said, that doesn't really tell us what we want to know, because what we want to know ultimately is whether you've got appropriate intellectual capital to drive your programs and your research and your mission and your strategic objectives. So what they've now asked is that the unit of reporting for faculty, and that then follows through on research tables, is focused at the discipline level. And there's a bit of detail to think about in terms of how you allocate that discipline. But what it's meant to do is to reflect, where does your intellectual capital sit? And then how do you use it? Now, once you've decided once you've decided on your disciplines, there is more flexibility in the allocation below that. So for example, the 60% qualification requirement is removed. Schools are not required to have the 40% essay at every single level, every single program, every single location. But as I said earlier, this is where you've got gray areas. This is where you've got subjectivity. And this is where you have to be prepared to ensure that the decisions you take are strategically deployed and that are driving quality outcomes. And we're going to deal a lot more with this in our session next week. So we'll come back to that then. But I do see that this is one of the areas that would probably take schools a little bit of time to wrap their heads around. Key thing is you cannot present by department. It must be by discipline.
Joanne, can I just jump in and ask you a question?
Sure, yeah.
I have a question from Melanie, who is, if a partnership is with an engineering school, can we exclude non-business faculty?
The simple answer is yes, but the devil is always in the detail. So that's what I would say. Simple answer is yes, you would, because it's specialty. And they're your specialty faculty. They're not teaching core business programs, but the devil is always in the detail. And I would always look at each of those carefully, either with your mentor, with a CSB liaison person, or with an external advisor, if you've got one. But I would always just explore those carefully and look at the detail, so it doesn't come back up to trip later.
Thank you.
So that's the simple and the complex answer in one.
Thank you.
No problem. The last area then, just very quickly, is assurance of learning. So assurance of learning has always facilitated both direct and indirect measures, but the emphasis under the 2013 standards was always on the direct measures. And it's now recognized that this might not be always the best way to look at whether your competencies under our new terminology, whether the competencies are being appropriately supported by our individual programs. So schools are being encouraged to review their competencies, review their objectives, their competencies, and to consider whether some competencies might be better considered by using indirect measures, and then to work those into their assurance of learning. You no longer have to have direct measures for every single competency. You can have a mix. You can have direct only, a mix of direct and indirect, or indirect only, depending on what's appropriate for that competency. And again, this is an area where schools will need to make the strategic decision that makes sense in the context of their mission and what they're looking to achieve. So that's a really quick run through the key changes.
Joanne,
yeah.
Because there's a lot of question at the moment on disciplines, and I know that we're going to talk about it next week, but there's 4 questions already on that. So if you could just maybe say a little thing about discipline, we will address it more in details next week. But if you could maybe, because there is Sarah, Stuart, Alex, who are all asking questions about disciplines. What do you mean by discipline? What we have departments already and they're divided in discipline, would that be okay? So there's a lot of question on that. So if you could maybe say 2 words about that.
I'd say 2 words, but I'm going to caveat what I say by saying that we're going to go into more detail next week. I would also say to, as a second to that, to make sure to look at the AACSB workshops and webinars that are coming up in this area, because there's absolutely no doubt that this is an area that schools need to get right and need to spend a little bit of time on initially. Very broadly speaking, discipline would be the areas of emphasis in a school. So what are the areas that you say that you're good at in your school, that you deliver material on? So is it something that's strongly referenced in your mission? If you deliver a degree in a particular area, then that is by definition probably a discipline. However, and this is where the detail comes in, and I don't want to get stuck into this here because we could be here for the next hour on it. AACSB is encouraging schools to go up to a macro level. So at a very straightforward level, if you're doing something like if you've got a degree in human resources management, that could be part of a management discipline, or it might be part of a human resources discipline. And that's where the level of flexibility and the grey areas comes in. And disciplines will vary from school to school. And that's where schools will need to stand back and think about, well, how important is human resources management at our school? Is it just one of a suite of management disciplines, in which case it might go under our management discipline? Or is it actually something that we talk a lot about that's really core to our mission, that we've got a very key research stream in which case it maybe should stand as a discipline in its own right? And then there may be supporting subjects that you use to support lots of your degrees that maybe aren't in your degree headlines. I'm hesitant about saying any more, because I think the more I try to say things quickly, the more chance there is for misinterpretation. So I'm going to leave it at that and trust that if it's an area you really are interested in, that you log into Other Learning, whether it's us next week, whether it's AACSB in November, or whether it's specific webinars and sessions on it, or back to your mentor, AACSB liaison, your peer review chair if you're in the pilot process for the 2020 standards, or whether you go to an external advisor. But I think it is an area that is right to spend time on. And I'm going to jump on just quickly to transition. So I'm conscious there's a huge amount of detail in this table. This table is available on the QED website under resources. Anybody's free to go and download it. There's also transition information on the AACSB website, so have a look there. The one thing I would say is start planning now. Key things are, if you're having a peer review visit between now and next summer, you're under the 2013 standards, so focus on that. If your peer review visit is coming between next summer and June 2023, then you need to discuss with your AACSB staff liaison, with the chair of your peer review team, on whether or not you're going to go under 2013 or 2020, because there is a choice there. For anybody with eligibility or ICER submissions, you have a choice up until essentially next July's IAC meeting, which is basically submissions in April 2021. However, AACSB is encouraging 2020 submission. So again, this is where you need to reach out to your AACSB staff liaison and talk to them about what's most appropriate. Generally speaking, the guidance I'm hearing back is that if you're already well advanced in your eligibility or in your ICER, and you've been doing that under the 2013 standards, and that you're in regular touch with AACSB, they're probably happy to accept it under 2013. But if you're early in the process, you'll probably save yourself a lot of time and energy if you apply under 2020, because it saves having to do another transition process. And then finally, I would say that if you've got a progress report coming up, my understanding is that anything that is to be submitted from this December onwards, so in other words, for the February meeting, is to be submitted under the 2020 guidelines. And that will require you to include some form of gap analysis about how your school sits in terms of 2020 versus 2013. So again, another area that you need to look at. What I will add here before there's a deluge of questions is, remember this is a transition. And as in any transition, everybody is learning. That is, AACSB is learning, we're learning, you're learning. Businesses like Ben's and Academ or Digital Measures or any of the others are all learning. Mentors and reviewers are learning. And particularly as we go through the pilot process for ACSB, as they work through that, they may well come back and communicate additional guidance and clarifications, because that's what a pilot is for. It is to give, to give everybody a chance to work through it, see if it works as anticipated, or whether there needs to be fine tuning in any areas. So it's important through all of this, particularly over the next year or so, to stay really alert to what's going on, to check the website, the ACSB Exchange Forum, and then reach out to ACSB, whether it's the staff liaison, the mentor, or your external advisors if you've got one. But to realize that this is a learning process for everybody, and that we just need to stay in touch and to realize that sometimes things will change a little as we learn more about it. And that is it for the headline overview. So Ben, I'm going to throw back to you for the Q&A.
Thank you, Joanne. I will let you breathe a bit, so I will shoot the first question.
Thank you.
Frank, we have a question from Abir. From the perspective of faculty members, what are the action items from their side to support their school in meeting the new standards?
Okay, that's a very broad question, of course. Well, first of all, as a dean, you always hope that your faculty is engaged and that they're participating also in the strategy formation process, and that they are critical in that process, that they alert also you, because if they are engaging also with external stakeholders, they can capture relevant information and so on. Apart from, of course, being good in their discipline and so on, these are important elements where faculty members can contribute. And it has been stressed over and over again, AACSB accreditation is much more clearly about strategy and alignment in this strategy. So in that sense, not only the participation of the faculty in the strategy formation process is important, but also the recognition that there must be a sense for alignment, that they align themselves also. Now, if you just look at it, faculty are the strategic asset of a university, of a business school. They're also a very expensive factor in the whole thing. So if you just look at it from a business perspective, you must be sure that that there is a kind of return, a kind of value, and the key is there in deliver quality and seek alignment and be critical also of the strategy by giving your feedback, because you also have interactions with internal stakeholders. The reason why strategy and agility around that is so important is because challenges are shifting. The environment of businesses is changing so rapidly that must have an impact on business schools. And that is capturing this information so that schools are better aligned with those changes, can anticipate, is something where faculty can have an essential and crucial role.
Thank you. Joanne?
Nothing to add to that. I think Frank has covered it beautifully.
We have a few additional questions, and well, Frank, I'll start with you again. Sorry about that. On impact and Standard 9, and what is your vision of this new chapter? Because Joanne spoke about it as the new piece in the puzzle. So what is your intake on that?
Well, it is new and not new. If you already see, in fact, AACSB has reviewed its own strategy, and after 2013, and the elements of innovation, engagement, and impact have become very important. So there were preambles almost to the 2013 standards. Now they are, in a very consequent way, integrated. Now, the point is that, or an important element there is that the explicit link is made, also now in the standards, with societal impact for the better. So and it's fully aligned with the mission statement of AACSB itself. I mean, business schools should be there, and business education should be there for betterment of society and the life of people and so on. So this element is very clear. How you are doing that as a school and in which way you are contributing that, once again, this depends on what kind of strategic positioning you are seeking for your own school. That's once again the mission drivenness and so on. We cannot expect that all schools are going as far as others can go. We have big schools, we have smaller schools, and so on. You have schools who are more specialized and so on. But this reflection should be everywhere. What is also important in that regard is the increasing recognition of the importance of lifelong learning, which is also an element of continuous social impact, I guess. You have seen, in fact, in the additional interpretation of the standards of 2013, they were struggling a bit with that. Should we talk about non-degree programs and so on? Traditionally, AACSB was about degree programs in business. So, but you clearly see, if you are then talking about faculty sufficiency, if your faculty is, let's say, for 30% engaged in non-degree programs, this is eating your availability for your degree program. This was not really captured. You saw that this was shifting a bit more. And now they are turning it upside down and recognizing that this is a very important element of having impact. And that's also reflected in the new standards.
Thank you. Joanne?
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that, one of the things I would say is that it ties to Standard 1, because in Standard 1, schools are asked to explain the societal impact of their mission. So as Frank said, it's very much linked to the mission, and schools have got to determine within that whether their societal impact is going to be at a local level, a regional level, a national level, an international level. You must have societal impact, but as Frank said, it's very much back to what is appropriate for your school in your context.
Thank you. Actually, Joanne, stay on, because the next question is going to be this is I'm going to read the question from Brian, but just thinking about the impact of change on accreditation documentation, ICER, SIR document, it would appear at first glance that cluster 1 and 2 is where much of the previous data and narrative sits, and cluster 3, thought leadership, is more of an extended outcome / concluding section.
That's an interesting viewpoint. I mean, I think cluster 3 is very much around thought leadership and the societal impact piece. So standard 8 is what would have been standard 2, if I remember correctly, if I got my standards right. Make sure I'm not mixing them up live on air, in terms of your intellectual contributions and how you do that. And then standard 9, obviously around societal impact. I think standard 9, as Frank said, does push more strongly forward the kind of societal impact piece, which was there before, but hadn't been articulated quite as clearly or as firmly as it is now. I think a lot of the materials in the first 2 clusters are similar to what was in 2013 standards. They're certainly building on that. But I think, we do need to be careful that not to underestimate the challenge it can be for some schools to move into a principles-based framework and a principles-based mindset. And just not to because I think for some schools that's going to take a bit of a bend in mindset, because we're very compliance driven a lot of the time. Yeah.
Frank, do you want to add anything?
No, I think it was well kept. Just it's quite general, in fact. The new approach, you have to make your own case. Yeah. And really, okay, show this is what we want. We are doing it in a consistent, coherent way. So it always, regarding all the standards, in fact, you will always have the same story, and you have to make. And this is then one of the challenges also for the peer review. And so you all have experience probably that sometimes members of a peer review team tend to refer more to their reference framework and their school than trying to understand what the school is about. So this is a real challenge that AACSB is well aware of, and that's why they are rightfully investing in this training, if I can put it like that, making the judgments and so on. And it was very well presented, I must say, the way they have to do that by Joanne.
Thank you. There is also a question, and Frank, maybe here I'll put that for you first on your plate. It's coming from, I think, a Dutch school, and talking about the linkage with NVAO and AACSB. So maybe to give a bit of context, there is an agreement with the Dutch national accreditation body and AACSB, and there is also this kind of similar thing in the UAE, I think in other parts of Europe. So the national and international accreditation bodies are aligning themselves. So it's not so much on the new standards, but it's a linkage between those national accreditation standards and international standards. If you want to maybe say a few words on that.
Well, when I was in Belgium, in Antwerp, I was lucky, in fact, to convince NVAO to accept our AACSB accreditation as equivalent for the national requirements. So that was indeed very good. So, and other schools then contacted me to attempt, in fact, to discuss also with the national accreditation body. Of course, it's also in the interest of AACSB. If they can, let's say, propose a value added that when you have AACSB accreditation, you are safe for your national integration. That's of course great. Now, what you see is that it is not always an easy process, in the sense that some national bodies don't let go the control or whatever. They tend also to be often more prescriptive and so on. But you see in Europe, and you see it with the NVAO, there is clearly a tendency also to be more principle-based and strategic oriented. So in that sense, what you see, what is going on with the new standards of AACSB, you see it also as a general evolution. And in that sense, finding each other is probably realistic. Now, what is important there, AACSB, that AACSB or other international accreditation bodies take a proactive stand and try to liaise with the national bodies and explain and try to convince. And of course, schools themselves, they can help in this process by lobbying. And it's in a certain sense in your benefit, because all those accreditation processes you have to go through, it's a burden, of course, of the school. But NVAO, I think, and the cooperation with the AACSB is an excellent example.
Thank you. Joanne?
Forgot to unmute, sorry. I would just echo the point that if you're based somewhere that one of these agreements is not in place and you think it would be beneficial, it's the regional area's responsibility to raise that and to lobby AACSB to go to promote that. And I think within, for example, the Ireland UK Accreditation Group, I think they're possibly talking about doing that for the systems within Ireland and the UK. And if they're not, they should be.
Thank you. A question from Nida, and I will. It's linked to discipline, but I'll still shoot it. For schools that already have a department-based structure, is it necessary to alter the structure? The discipline-based faculty reporting can still be carried out.
That's actually a really good question, Nida. Thanks for asking it. No, AACSB is not remotely suggesting that you alter your structures within your school. The structures are as works for your administration. It's how you report that's important, and you must report by discipline, regardless of whether that's similar to your academic structure or whether it's different. You must report by discipline. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
Frank?
Yeah, the answer of Joanne is right. I mean, that's exactly what AACSB wants and so on. But maybe the question was triggered by another experience, because I have also seen it in a certain sense. Once again, it is who is in your peer review team. He or she might often also have expectation and refer to their own framework. And that's why the whole discussion of discipline, the borderlines of the discipline, how you present it, will be a delicate test that AACSB has to go through the processes. Often it is easily translated by the traditional disciplinary departments, especially when you have deans coming from such an institute, and But that is not clearly the intention as far as I understood it from AACSB. But it will be a test case. I mean, that will be where the pilot cases are important, how is that dealt with, and so on. But essentially, it's once again the same answer. What do you need? How you, but AACSB in no way imposes a kind of organizational structure. That's not at all the point.
Thank you. We have questions on the Q&A around data linked to that, to discipline and departments. So except if you want to say something on the school and the way they structure it, I won't answer anything academic related directly there, but so I'm shooting the question to you guys, and happy to take it privately, but I won't do it on the webinar.
So what's the exact question, Ben?
It was a question on how to link the data between department and discipline, but so I'm putting it out, but
okay, I'm going to give it the answer that I would give any school regardless of accreditation. So this is not without reference. So I'm not even referencing particularly Ben or anybody else on this particular one. One of the jobs QED often does is we do initial gap analysis with schools. So schools come along to us, talk about being interested in accreditation, and kind of want to get an independent view of where they are in terms of readiness for an accreditation. So it's a typical job that we would do all around the world. And one of the things that comes up, I would say, in 90% plus of the schools is how they manage their data and the availability of data. And for any school going towards accreditation, I would say that it is absolutely imperative to have a data system. Now, whether you do an off-the-shelf system, such as Academ, or for the sake of just being fair, Digital Measures or Watermark or Sedona or anything else, whether you develop one internally, that is down to each individual school and what's required. But it is imperative to have a system. If you try to do it manually, if you try to manage it on Excel, you will run into problems with comparability and consistency from accreditation to accreditation. You are open to running into problems when standards changed or get tweaked. And this is regardless of whether it's AMBA, an EFMD accreditation, or AACSB, it's general to all. But I couldn't emphasize enough the value of going for a proper system. And the one value of going for an off-the-shelf one is it's their job to look after changes and tweaks rather than yours when it comes to new standards and twists to standards and twists to data requirements. So that's my tuppence halfpenny. Frank, do you want to jump in with any extra?
Well, yeah, I just want to add something. I fully agree, but I also understand that some schools belonging to university might have challenges there because universities have their own reasoning and their own systems and so on. But I'm sure that Benjamin will have the answer there in terms of services that can be provided. But it is a challenge. And so, well, it has always been a challenge. If you have this international accreditation, university have their own system and data gathering and so on. What is the match and so on. But I fully agree, you need to have a systematic way to do it. And you fully have to understand it once again in line with your strategy. And if you are a school belonging to a university, speak to your provost or to the central administration and make sure that you have, let's say, the sufficient flexibility to do what you need to do.
Thank you. One question, we have we have time for two more questions before the end, but one question from Jerry, which is, to what degree is equity required across a disciplinary unit to demonstrate impact?
My short answer to that would be, needs to align with your mission. So the areas that you say important are the ones that are important. That's my very short answer. Frank, you're laughing at me, so turn on your microphone and add.
I like short answers, especially when they are correct. I mean, once again, and you already said it, Joanne, before, when we are talking about social impact, in the first standard, you already have to identify where you want, as from a strategic point of view, what kind of choices you are making. Strategy is about focus. You cannot do everything. It's by in the first place saying what you will not do, so that you have the focus and really do it. So in that sense, it's a correct answer.
Thank you. So I have one last question, and I'm sorry, but I'm Arugan, but you asked it 3 times, so I'm going to put it to the panelists. Can a financial school go for its program-based accreditation, or it should first go for an institutional accreditation or business accreditation?
Okay.
I think Frank wanted to answer. He looked like...
No, because I see kind of, let's say, competition emerging between accreditation, international accreditation agencies behind that, of course. Well, honestly speaking, I cannot give advice on that in general terms. That's, you just have to see what you feel good with, what is your what are your needs, and what is helpful for you, for your development of your school, for the reputation, the branding of the school. It would be up to you. If you see it as a learning process, because I think that sometimes that is schools are looking at, and you start, let's say, with program accreditation to learn a bit whatever. But okay, once again, it's up to the school. So going for, let's say, through the motion is very important. Anyway, so if you just ask schools who went through initial accreditation, you say, what was the main point the main benefit of it? They will say, going through the process and reflecting on ourselves, what we are, what we want to do, and so on. So that is then rather an argument to go for institutional accreditation, I would say.
Thank you. So that will conclude our webinar today. Frank, thank you so much for your time today. And
My pleasure.
Thanks, Frank.
For being there. And Joanne, thank you so much for your input. Great summary. And we are looking forward to Standard 3 next week, and to talk a lot about disciplines. And
Can I back out now?
No, you can't. Thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon, morning, or night, depending on where you're based. And speak to you all next week then.
That's great. Thanks to all the participants. Really appreciated you attending. Thank you.